I will deliver on its promise, building an economy that embraces the opportunities of Brexit.
Brexit is doing the economy real damage.
Brexit, as negotiated, is frankly a disaster.
During the Brexit campaign, many supporters of the Vote Leave movement predicted that the UK's leaving would set off a chain reaction, with other nations following suit. But this has definitely not occurred after nearly 7 years. If anything, the opposite is true. Several nations still aspire to join the EU, and 3 have officially filed for candidate status after the Brexit vote: Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Meanwhile, polling indicates that support for the EU among member states is at an all-time high, with big majority supporting the EU's handling of Ukraine and no enthusiasm for quitting the bloc. Thus, in today's video, we'll look at why there hasn't been a domino effect since Brexit, since recent polls show that the concept of leaving the EU has seen a major fall in popularity among member nations. Hello and welcome to Economic News. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe with all notifications turned on so that you won't miss any of our upcoming videos talking about anything economic related. Now, let us get back to the video. Let's start with the polls. Respondents to a recent European social survey were asked how they would vote in a fictitious referendum on whether their nation should stay in the EU. Initially in 2016 to 17, then in 2020 to 2022. Support for quitting the EU declined in every member country, with Finland experiencing the greatest reduction. Support for leaving was strongest in the Czech Republic, Italy, and Sweden in the most recent round of the poll, although even those nations have experienced a dip since Brexit. Nevertheless, according to the most recent Eurobarometer poll, a majority of Europeans feel positive about the future of the EU, which, while down from last year, is still considerably above historical norms. So, what exactly happened? Why hasn't a Brexit domino effect occurred? As far as we can tell, there were essentially 2 key reasons. First, the UK's post-Brexit difficulties, and then the EU's response to several crises since. Let us begin with how the United Kingdom has managed post-Brexit. Britain has been in political instability since 2016, with 5 prime ministers in 6 years and increasing economic concerns. All of this has been widely covered in the European news, and it is commonly assumed that Brexit is to blame. Brexit discussions also provided its smaller members a reassurance that the larger members would stand up for them if a problem arose. The majority of EU nations, 22 out of 27, have populations of roughly 20 million or less, with just 5, France, Germany, Poland, Spain, and Italy, having populations of more than 35 million. The manner in which the EU and its larger members defended Ireland's interests throughout the Brexit discussion significantly boosted cohesiveness and confidence in the Union. But it is not only Brexit that has scared other nations away from leaving. Since 2016, the EU has faced a succession of crises, to which it has reacted admirably. As far as we can tell, there have been at least 3 distinct crises: the COVID-19 pandemic, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the United States of America. Let us begin with the COVID-19 pandemic. The EU was under severe hardship at the beginning of the outbreak, while Italy, the first European country to be hit by the virus, suffered with the worst impacts of the pandemic in early 2020. A heated debate erupted inside the EU over so-called corona bonds, which effectively included the issuance of bonds at the EU level to fund the European response to COVID. Several nations, most notably the Frugal Four, Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Sweden, rejected any debt-sharing measures, while Angela Merkel, Germany's then Chancellor, called it as the worst crisis since the EU was created. Christine Lagarde famously stated that it was not the role of the European Central Bank to close spreads. This stench did not sit well with the Italians or the smaller member states, and it appeared that the EU was going to reenact the psychodrama of the early 2010s, when so-called creditor countries chastised so-called debtor countries for their budgetary recklessness. But in the end, the EU agreed to establish a huge recovery fund for the most severely affected member states, the greatest rescue program in European history and many times larger in inflation-adjusted terms than the post-World War II Marshall Plan. The recovery fund shattered the taboo on debt sharing and encouraged smaller member countries to be more hopeful about the possibility of such initiatives in the future that may significantly benefit their economies. Putin's conflict in Ukraine is the second crisis on our list. The foundation of the EU was at least partially driven by a desire to move away from the turmoil of the early 20th century and ensure peace on the European continent. Prior to Putin's invasion, this was obsolete, and the danger of an interstate conflict in Europe seemed improbable. That has certainly changed, and the EU has responded to the war in a very proactive manner. The EU has coordinated sanctions and armament delivery, and the EU has demonstrated extraordinary cooperation throughout the crisis. According to the most recent Eurobarometer poll, 74% of Europeans approve of the EU's assistance for Ukraine, and 81% consider the EU as crucial to their homeland safety. This is a remarkable shift from a few years ago, when the EU was commonly seen as a slogging and ineffectual bureaucracy plagued by political bickering. The United States of America is the final crisis on the list. America has made it obvious in recent years that its interests do not coincide with those of Europe. Clearly, you have Trump, whose America First ideology has made many Europeans think they can no longer rely on America for either political or military backing. And while Biden's presidency has brought some temporary confidence, Biden and the EU still have some major disputes. The EU, for example, is not as aggressive on China as the US, and numerous EU leaders, including Macron, have expressed displeasure with Biden's big inflation reduction legislation, which offers significant incentives to American firms while putting European industry at a disadvantageous position. Furthermore, Trump or a Trump-like candidate may easily win in 2024 or 2028, and many European governments have learned that they can no longer rely on the US as heavily as they once did. Individual European states, particularly the smaller ones, are mostly impotent in this new context of global rivalry, and the only avenue for them to advocate for themselves is through the EU. This new period of geopolitical rivalry, as well as the rising gap between Europe and America, has forced European governments to understand that they must band together to safeguard their interests, and the EU is the only institution with sufficient geopolitical strength to do so. Clearly, European integration seems to be considerably stronger in 2022 than it was previous to the Brexit decision in 2016. It isn't to claim that everything is perfect. As previously said, the EU is facing a number of dangers. Yet, Europeans are overall more enthusiastic about the EU, and European unity appears to be stronger than at any point in recent memory. Thank you for watching this video. Please leave a comment down below, adding any more issues or crises that have impacted the positive reaction for the EU, and also showcasing the blunder of a case for the UK. Also, do check out our other videos on the channel if you want to continue your support for this channel. Take care now and goodbye!